Hello, I'm Henry Kuhn, and today we're going to be talking about Band of Brothers as a historical monument to World War II. Hmm, There you go. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Band of Brothers as it relates to the idea of the good war memory in America and for the other Allied powers. But first, a little bit about Band of Brothers as a TV show in general. Um, Band of Brothers had a stellar cast of movie tier actors from the United States and the UK. It was directed and produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, who were well known and reputable at the time, and coming just 3 years off of the smashing success of Saving Private Ryan, which is one of the most famous war movies ever made. Um, the show had a gigantic budget of over 125 million, with an additional 15 million allocated to advertising. Um, and they filmed it in the UK. And so between and that 15 million also included a screening to veterans. So they've done a huge blowout, tons of advertising, tons of money to the project. It was poised to be a huge hit, a huge deal, and a huge success in many countries where it was planning to air. Um, and its first episodes came out on September 9th, 2001. Um, and for a little bit, they were viewed very well, came out on Sunday, and they were viewed with great success. And then, tragically, just 2 days after the show premiered, with good applause, the tragic events of 9/11 unfurled. Um, and as you can imagine, with the wave of devastation and trauma and fear that came over society, there's very few people watching um, TV for the next few days. Um, but um, as the smoke cleared and as sort of the people emerged, there was a huge wave of patriotism all throughout the country. Um, and for some, the screaming airplanes and the Americans dying was too much, but for many, there was a wave of patriotism, and even a push to go um, and to wage war abroad for justice for security after the events of 9/11. And so the events of 9/11, the advertising campaign actually stopped advertising insensitivity of the attacks, but um, in effect, there was very little that could have been as influential a springing board of sorts. I guess that's a weird way to say it for this show, but it put the national emotions and character all behind the show, and people got really, really excited for the show, for patriotism, for the troops, um, and it it was only up from there after the attacks. One police officer, I'm forgetting from, yes, actually, Bodner, in his criticism of the good war narrative and of Ambrose specifically for Band of Brothers, writes that so many people um, were filled with the heroism of the show that one police officer actually wrote Dick Winters, one of the main characters from Band of Brothers, and said, and I quote, a New York City police officer wrote him, Winters, after the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center to say that the television series inspired him to carry on his duty no matter what. Um, which I think is a interesting way to critique Band of Brothers from Bodner. But anyways, so what's interesting about Band of Brothers is that it is based off of firsthand accounts, and it's based off a book which is nonfiction by someone who's technically a historian, but not a documentary TV show. It's a series, and so it's a really niche bit of television that many would call a docudrama. Um, And so that allows it to have a lot of the benefits, but a lot of the takebacks of both a documentary and a drama. It has the potential to have the truth of a documentary and the emotional content of a drama, but it also receives the criticisms of both. And a lot of people accuse it naturally of um, being too emotionally insightful or too emotional or for stretching the truth into making a narrative, which of course it's not film, so it can't be exactly true. But the medium is a very interesting way of investigating this sort of material. It's interesting. Paget also writes quite interestingly about the extent to which all the people writing and making movies right at the 50th anniversary of World War II, like Ambrose, like Spielberg, they're writing to a dying generation. So there's a sense in which these pieces of art serve as elegies or even eulogies for these veterans. So it's sort of a different context. It's sort of a poem and a beautiful send off to a generation, as opposed to maybe giving the criticism they deserve. But to pivot, I think it's important to look at the historicity of these people. This is an archived actual picture of Easy Company training here in Georgia. Um, and I keep looking at this picture because it's just, I mean, it's just like a great picture you'd find of anyone else training, but it's the people that are focused on and written about in this story. And I think it's so cool to see the actual footage. Um, I also had several news articles oh, about this 101st and the 506th Airborne specifically. This is one of them here, talking about the famous General McAuliffe saying they can have nuts at the Battle of Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge. But it's all these things that can be traced and technically with um, news articles and journals and official military documents. Band of Brothers is not fictional, and except to the extent to which people tweak minor details. It is based off of a factual count of factual deeds that were done by real people. All right, so pretty much anyone that's going to talk about World War II and the way it's been remembered is going to be talking about this idea of the good war. And sort of wrapped up in this idea of the good war is this idea that um, the Americans and the Allies fought a good war and that it was a good thing. People say things like, it got us out of the Depression, it made the greatest generation. Um, we needed a war, it toughened us up. And we were doing good things, we did nothing wrong, and so that's something that any piece of media that acknowledges this time period has to acknowledge. And so, as you see on the screen here, there's a picture um, of shooting an unarmed man. And of course, that's really not that big of a deal because actually he is armed, but it's really not that big of a deal. It's war, it's understood. But the implications of what it means to be a good war are something that the show really does explore, actually. Um, for instance, um, Private Dyke is an example, Buck is an example, and Renee are an example. Now, Buck is this gentleman here in the middle. He's one of the strongest, most accomplished leaders in all of Easy Company. He's there through thick and thin in all the firefights. But later on in Bastogne, he sees um, two of his good buddies blown to bits and is no longer able to even really communicate or serve in the war and is sent away. Um, Lieutenant Dyke is shell shocked and unable to see. He's sent to the hospital for a long time. Um, Dyke is paralyzed by his fear until Winters gives him a pick up talk, and he goes and he becomes totally competent. And shortly after, he is shot through the neck. He's done. And then also in this Bastogne episode, there is a Dutch girl named Renee who serves as a symbol of peace and of kindness and of healing throughout the show. And she does nothing but help people. And she's sort of this like this light in the show, and where there's so much darkness. And at the end of the show, she's blown up by a German bombing raid on Christmas Eve. Um, and so each of these examples um, don't really fit in that sort of good war narrative. Um, the arc of someone like Dyke going from incompetent to competent and facing his fears and then being killed immediately after. Um, Buck, this example of strength and goodness. Um, and then he's crippled to total incompetence. Um, and of course, Renee. Um, it's it's an examples of the tragedy and the devastation of war. And so to say that this show shows war is a good thing and it's only goodness prevailing is not true because the pain, aside from gory visual effects detail, is also psychologically and several different characters that are studied. Now, perhaps one of the biggest critiques of Stephen Ambrose and Steven Spielberg and Band of Brothers in general, aside from Bodnar, who actually read 21 Right of the Moon Square, there is a guy named Confessor who writes an academic journal critiquing um, and accusing Stephen Ambrose and um, Steven Spielberg of abusing nostalgia in their works and sort of contributing to this good war narrative. Um, he writes pages on Ambrose for his abuse of popularity and inauthenticity of his work. He makes claims that the U.S. wasn't actually in the war to save Jews or to hurt Nazis. It was only in there to fight Japan. He makes claims that we underplay the role of the Russians and of the Germans and make a totally Americanized, centralized version of the war. Um, he says that the GIs fought largely not because they wanted to or being some sort of moral, upstanding men, but that they were fighting because they were made to. Um, and this is a poignant retort. And Ambrose writes way out of his depth, as many famous people do. But I don't think it's totally fair to totally criticize and reject Band of Brothers and the collective works of Stephen Ambrose and Steven Spielberg as abusing nostalgia. They do show their screenings to veterans, and they do support veterans, and they do show heroism. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their work does not have authenticity or value. Um, and I think that's something important to remember is that just because these men are shown as heroes does not mean they're shown incorrectly. In episode nine, the members of Easy Company stumble upon a um, Nazi concentration camp filled with starving Jews. They found out that the Nazis have left them behind because they ran out of bullets and couldn't shoot them all in time. Um, and the soldiers have to deal with the sort of I mean, just the horrificness of finding such a thing. It's a really emotional episode, and they have to look at these people. And the episode is titled "This Is Why We Fight," and it sort of shows they didn't really realize what they were fighting, um, but this is what their fighting has led them to. Um, and I mean, to think of something as horrific as this, I don't know that you can really think of the Holocaust and of a concentration camp and think of a good war. Um, it's certainly good that they helped these people, but it's absolutely tragic and horrible. After after they discover the concentration camp, moved away from the war, and they come and they are stationed in Austria, where they're really just waiting. As the Germans have surrendered, they're waiting to see if they're going to go to Japan. They're trying to see if they have enough points to get sent home. Um, they keep dying and they keep fighting. One of them shoots another one in the head. They keep getting in car crashes. Um, and the episode really explores the concept that these soldiers can't find peace. Um, and it's really hard and tragic. And it's weird because they're supposed to be so happy, but it's not really until they have peace that they realize the scars of the war. Um, and this is sort of demonstrated in the fact that even when they're at peace, several of these soldiers go and hunt down an old man who worked at a concentration camp, and they execute him in his house in front of his wife. Um, it's really dark, but I mean they're Nazis, so of course it feels like they deserve it. But it goes to show that these men don't know how to be happy and to be content and to be at peace. Um, and it sort of leaves on an open note of their suffering. It goes on to say that these men live and they go on back home and they have successful lives. Um, but it does raise the question of the price that they paid psychologically. Um, and not that this was a good war, but it does conclude by saying that these men, these were good men.